Okay, so guess what? I said we done it before. Everybody knows.
All right, welcome everyone to the February 9th, 2023 meeting of the North Texas Archaeological Society. Happy to see many smiling faces in the room this evening. You didn't see me except on a computer last time. I am Alan Rutherford. I'll be your president for the next 2 years. So you'll get to see my face up here quite a bit in the coming months. Before we get to our speaker, we have a few general announcements. We'd like to welcome the new members who signed up over the course of the last month. The North Texas Archaeological Society at this moment is now up to 326 members, which is pretty impressive. Having said that, it's time to renew your North Texas Archaeological Society membership if you have not done so yet. The forms are online, or you can mail in. You can either do it via the website, or you can print off the information that you need either from the newsletter or from the website and mail in those forms with a check. This is a reminder that there are free NTAS memberships for students. So please see the scholarship page on the website if you're a student and you would like a free membership to the North Texas Archaeological Society. I'd like to take a moment to thank, we've had a few donations over the course of the last month, so thank you very much. That's very helpful for keeping things moving with the society and funding things like scholarships. This is a reminder that this weekend, February 11th and 12th, excavations will resume at the Clovis field site. If you would like to volunteer for that, please contact Chris Mice. That should say our March 2023 guest speaker, forgive me, will be Tom Ashmore and C.A. Majan. They'll be discussing the Campmire Spring Conquistador and Lower Pecos River Spanish soldiers pictographs. This is a very early announcement, but it's something that we're going to present a little bit later on this spring. We have accepted an invitation to be involved at the DAS summer camp on June 21st through 23rd. So please consider volunteering to do that. Like I said, we'll have a small presentation at some point here this spring, kind of describing what it means to volunteer at the summer camp. As you can see to my left over here, the snacks are a success and a hit. Please get with Steve Lowe if you would like to volunteer to bring snacks in future months. And finally, registration is still open for the Rock Art and Archaeology 101 TAS Academy. As I checked the website today, there is one spot left in the Rock Art Academy. Registration is also open for the TAS Field School. I'm not a native Texan, so you'll have to forgive me when I pronounce Natchitoches. Is that correct? Natchitoches. Okay, got it. All right. There is a Natchitoches, right? Yeah, right. It's in Louisiana, though. Got it. Okay. All right. I'll try. I will promise that I will try to pronounce it correctly in the future, but I certainly will not pronounce it correctly. I'm certain.
Wait until you get to Mahia.
Mahia, I think I can do. Information can be found on the TAS website. This is also a reminder that the North Texas Archaeological Society has scholarships that cover TAS membership, academy, and field school registration. So if you know a student or a teacher out there who wants to join us at the field school and they'd like a little support in doing so, send them to the website and have them look at those scholarships. My goodness. Our February 2023 guest speaker is Dr. Brendon Asher from Eastern New Mexico University. He's also the director of the Blackwater Draw National Landmark and Museum. He is joining us via Zoom. He's in Portales this evening. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen now and he'll start sharing his. And we'll get going on the presentation. I'm excited to hear what he has to tell us tonight.
Get feedback.
All right, can you guys actually see the presentation and hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Well, great. Thank you, Alan, for the introduction, and thank you to the North Texas Archaeological Society for the chance to talk to you guys tonight a little bit about Blackwater Draw and the last 90 years of research that have taken place out here. I didn't realize there were going to be snacks at the meeting, so maybe I should have tried to make it in person, but it is snowing here in Portales tonight, so hopefully the connection will stay solid. For those not familiar with where Blackwater Draw is, we're on the western edge of the Llano Estacado, the southern high plains, and eastern New Mexico. And it's essentially a drainage that flows to the southeast to Lubbock and meets up with Yellow House Draw and becomes the Brazos River. And prehistorically, this would have been a substantial traffic way, a major route of travel, even though today, for those that have been out in this area, you know, there's no water anymore in eastern New Mexico. The site itself was discovered in 1929 by a young rancher. He was 19 years old at the time, by the name of James Ridgely Whiteman. And he was out of Portales, and he was up walking around at today what is the Blackwater Draw site, and collecting artifacts from the surface that he recognized as significant. And he sends a letter off to the Smithsonian, trying to get them interested in this discovery that he had made. Unfortunately, I don't have the first letter within this chain of correspondence, but I have the response that the Smithsonian sent back on February 15th, 1929. And I've blown up a portion here that says, before doing so, however, I wish to inquire specifically about that short one with the long flake struck from the middle. Can you recall just where you found this, whether it came from the surface of the ground or from an arroyo? It is of interest to us at this time because of certain studies now going forward in our laboratory. The studies were the Folsom site, which had been excavated 2 years previous in 1926 and 1927. Would you care to leave it with us? And it's funny, and a response letter originally says, oh, I have a bunch of these. You can keep it. That's okay. Ridgely's response on February 25th, the location we find the heads, and this is referring to arrowheads, is in the dips in the sand hills that goes down below the natural surface. The one specified was found in a place like this, 14 miles south of Clovis. I found many of these. All of them are in these kinds of places. We'll be glad to get any information I can, as studying this alone, one makes many mistakes. And this is really a tribute to Ridgely, being a 19-year-old rancher with no training in archaeology, recognizing that, yeah, I'm going to reach out for help and get some professionals involved at this site. Follow-up response from the Smithsonian on March 8th, 1929. For our confidential museum record, 5 of the chip blades shown in one of the prints accompanying Mr. Ridgely Whiteman's letter of February 25th, 1929, are of the same type as those found associated with extinct bison remains at Folsom, New Mexico. From the same general locality, he reports fossil mammal bones, perhaps elephant or mastodon. But they go on and they say, we have no reason to infer any association, in fact, between the mammal remains and the chip blades. So unfortunately, nobody investigates Blackwater Draw for several more years. The person that does come out and finally excavates is Edgar Howard. And Howard started working in New Mexico in the same year that Ridgely discovered the site in 1929. He was a master's student out of Pennsylvania that went back to school later in life because he was interested in finding early human sites in the Americas. And he thought we're going to find them in caves. So he's working down in the Guadalupe Mountains around Carlsbad with the idea or the understanding that in Europe, in the old world, all the sites are being found in caves. So he's searching in caves, specifically, pardon me, one called Burnett Cave in Eddy County. And what's ironic is that in 1931, he actually discovers the first documented Clovis spear point in an archaeological excavation. The problem was Blackwater Draw hadn't been investigated yet, so there was no name for this type, even though Howard had discovered one in 1931. It wouldn't be until 1932 that he visits Blackwater Draw. And there's another event that takes place in North America that's significant this same year. It's related to Clovis and early discoveries of Clovis. And that's the Dent site discovery in Northeast Colorado. And what's significant, and we can get into debates about this all the time and discuss it forever. Dent was discovered in April 1932. Edgar Howard did not visit Blackwater Draw until August of 1932. So Dent was actually observed earlier. The problem is that the artifacts that were found originally were out of place. They had been eroded from the original context, and excavations would not be conducted until 1933 at Dent. So that gave a small window here for Blackwater Draw to become the type site for Clovis. It's very possible that if not for Howard's visit, we'd be calling the spear points you see pictured there Dent points today instead of Clovis from Blackwater Draw. So here's a couple images from Howard's first visit in August of 1932. And you'll actually see this image illustrated in a lot of publications. And typically it's captioned as being at Blackwater Draw. It's actually not. This is at a locality that's about 7 miles to the east of Blackwater Draw called Anderson Basin. And to tie in the work that Howard was doing around Carlsbad to how he ended up at Blackwater Draw, and that last name is an important name to this story. So Anderson was a journalist in Carlsbad, and he met up with Howard, and he decided in the early 1930s, he's going to move to Portales in eastern New Mexico because they were getting ready to build Cannon Air Force Base. So he thought this was going to be a big economic boom for the region. Subsequently, Anderson meets Ridgely Whiteman, and it's through that correspondence from 19-year-old Ridgely Whiteman to the journalist Anderson that Howard eventually gets invited up to Blackwater Draw in August of 1932. The image you see in the bottom right is the modern day location of where that tusk is eroding out at the Anderson Basin locality. Significantly, after Edgar Howard goes back to Pennsylvania, in November of the same month in 1932, the New Mexico Department of Transportation starts gravel mining at Blackwater Draw. And they put in 2 gravel trenches, and what you're seeing pictures of here are one of the trenches. And if you look really close in the cut bank, it's full of bone. So they went straight through the archaeological deposits. And Howard hears about this back in Pennsylvania, and he returns to the site in November, which wasn't easy to do in 1932 because there were no roads out here. And the reason they were mining was to get gravel to build the roads. And he sends off a telegram. Extensive bone deposit at new site, mostly bison, also horse and mammoth, some evidence of hards along edges. We'll tie up permissions for future work and spend a few more days investigating. And as they say, the rest is history. The image on the left shows Edgar Howard back in Pennsylvania with some of the artifacts from Blackwater Draw from the 1930s work. And the image on the right is fun because it has Edgar Howard in it second from the left, as well as Ridgely Whiteman, third from the right. So that was the original excavation crew that worked out here, wearing the same style of clothes most of us wear to excavate in today. One of the big discoveries in the 30s was bone rods. And we see these at other Clovis sites like Anzick in Montana. And the purpose of these is still not fully understood. One suggestion is that they're the foreshaft for the composite dart shaft, as you can see illustrated on the right there. What everybody thinks about when they think of Blackwater Draw is the Clovis type specimens. And the two illustrated here are the Clovis type specimens that all of Clovis technology was defined after. And you'll notice the accession numbers start with 36. So it took them a few years to actually find Clovis points in place. It wasn't until 1936 that they found these 2 points in stratigraphic context with mammoth remains. This is important because they recognized it as being below Folsom. So they knew it was earlier. They didn't know how much earlier, they just knew it was earlier in time. And Blackwater Draw became, because of this, the first site where the relationship between Clovis and Folsom was demonstrated. Howard decides to take the site back, literally, to Pennsylvania. He collects all the mammoth remains and the stone artifacts, and he reconstructs, based off his plan view, what he called the Clovis Mammoth Pit that was on display at the International Symposium on Man in 1937. So this was a chance for all the scientists to come visit the quote unquote site as it had been reconstructed and verify definitively, yeah, this is the work of humans earlier than Folsom. Unfortunately, Edgar Howard passed away shortly after that symposium. So his work out of Blackwater was cut short, and it wouldn't be until the late 1940s that other institutions started working out at the site, including Sellards, who started working in 1949. And one of the big discoveries of Sellards was a bison kill, which, you know, that's not uncommon in Paleo-Indian, but this was the first time it had been demonstrated that Clovis people were also hunting bison. We've seen that pattern repeated numerous times since 1955, but this was the first documented occurrence of Clovis spear points, specifically the 3 that are illustrated there with bison remains. Sellards also defined the Portalis complex, and this was named after a series of projectile points that were excavated in 1949 to 1950 that were recognized as being above Clovis and Folsom, but they didn't have the characteristic channel flake or flute removed from the base. So they were a different style, and there's actually several different types represented here. We no longer use the term Portalis complex because each of these different styles or types now has been described and defined from subsequent discoveries at other type sites. Most of these are what we lump into the Cody complex. So Scotts Bluff, Eden, there is some Agate Basin. So it's all late Paleo after Folsom. Starting in 1953, the property again changed hands, and it became a commercial gravel mine by an individual by the name of Sam Sanders out of Clovis. And to give you the extent of the gravel mining, the image you're looking at On the right, the aerial, that's the site, and that's 156 acres. And you can see in the topographic map above it, the giant pit, that's all dug out from gravel mining. They were removing 1 to 200 cubic yards of sand and gravel every single day. And to get to the commercial sand and gravel, you had to go through the archaeological deposits. So 1 to 200 cubic yards of archaeological material getting destroyed every day. To the extent that people in Clovis to the north and folks in Portales to the south were actually finding artifacts in their driveways because the gravel was coming from this gravel quarry. We lost a lot of the site because of that, but at the same time, we wouldn't have known what all was here. Most of the discoveries that have taken place were the result of this gravel mining out at Blackwater Draw. A couple images just showing an advertisement for Sam Sanders, Sanders Sand and Gravel Company. And at that time, there was still water here. When they were digging, they intercepted the water table. So a lot of the gravel mining was actually done from a barge with a dredge line, which is hard to picture today when you're out of the site, because as I mentioned earlier, there's no more surface water out here. This led to a series of discoveries in the 1960s that were primarily conducted by the Llano Archaeological Society, which was formulated by Jim Warnica, who was a local avocational archaeologist out of Portales. And significantly, what they found and were able to salvage before it got destroyed by gravel mining was a series of 5 mammoth skeletons in a pretty small concentrated area, and associated with those over 200 stone artifacts. So it was definitively clear that if humans were not actually hunting and killing these mammoth, which they probably were because a lot of the stone artifacts were spear points, we know that they were at least there butchering and scavenging the carcass. Because of these discoveries, Blackwater Draw was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1961. But that was not enough to end the commercial gravel mining. The image on the left, again, a flyover aerial. And if you look close, you'll see white squares. Those are tarps. Each of the tarps is covering one of those mammoth skeletons. And kind of in the middle of those is some of the open ongoing excavation at the time. If you look way back in the top right of that picture, there's water. And the whole story of Blackwater Draw, why were Clovis people there? It was a spring-fed lake 13,000 years ago. So the whole story of the site really is closely tied to water. George Agogino came to eastern New Mexico in the 60s, and he started working out of Blackwater Draw in 1963. And ultimately, shortly after this time, he took over as kind of the sole principal investigator out there. So since about the mid-60s, most of the archaeological work that's been conducted has been through Eastern New Mexico University. A couple more images. George Agogino on top, Jim Warnica down on the bottom on the right there. The image on the left, if you look at the very top, you'll see some of the earth-moving equipment for the gravel mining. So much of the excavation in the 60s was done very quick. It was pretty much a salvage effort to recover any information they could in advance of it getting destroyed and removed by gravel mining. Frank Kibben visited during those early years, and he's pictured here holding the artifact that you see above. And that's one of the most iconic artifacts we have from Blackwater Draw, found directly associated with the mammoth, likely a butchery tool. It's unifacial. It's only worked on that one side, but it's probably a nice knife or scraper implement made out of Edwards chert from Central Texas. So most of the artifacts we see, that's a common pattern. Many are made out of Edwards. Including all of these. We do have 2 caches that have been found. The first was identified in 1962 by Earl Green, and it was 17 blades. You start counting, there's 18 pictured there, but 2 of those fragments actually refit. But 17 blades of Edwards chert, and then again, kind of reflective or reminiscent of that same prehistoric behavior in 1990. Joanne Dickinson discovered another cache that eroded out. Again, blades, smaller in number, but bigger in size. So 5 large blades, again, all Edwards chert from Central Texas. After Agogino took over in the mid-60s, most of the work shifted to the south portion of the site, to what we refer to today as the South Bank, and that's just telling us we're on the southern edge of the gravel mining disturbance. And you can see excavations in the early 60s here. If you visit the site today, and there's a large metal building that I'll show you here in a little bit that's covering a portion of this excavation. In 1964, this interesting anomaly, for lack of a better word, was discovered that you see pictured on the left. And basically, when it was first uncovered, it was a surface stain that was circular, so it was a disturbance. It was not natural. And when excavated, it went down about 3.5, 4 feet. And the interpretation is perhaps that it's a hand-dug well. They covered it back up in the 60s, and then it was excavated again in the 1990s, and that's the picture you see on the right with Joanne Dickinson and John Montgomery after it had been re-excavated in the 1990s. People like to ask, why are they digging a well if you have a spring-fed lake with fresh water? Well, the answer I always give, and whether it's correct or not, I don't know. We've recovered so far the remains of 28 mammoth at the site, all from within that lake. So you probably don't necessarily want to drink that water, all the carcasses that are in there. But one way to filter it is to dig a hole on the bank and filter it through the sand, and that will make it a little bit safer to drink. In 1967, an interesting character by the name of Alberto Ezequia started work at Blackwater Draw. He was an Argentinian that was studying archaeology in France and somehow got acquainted with George Agogino and decided to excavate in eastern New Mexico. How that happened, I have no idea. But essentially what he did was create a giant hole on the landscape, which we call the pit today. And it's back behind or to the south of the metal structure. And essentially he demonstrated that on the south bank, there is a pretty extensive late Paleo-Indian deposit that's a bison kill. For reasons not necessarily clear, he disappears overnight that same year, never to be seen again, and he didn't backfill. So we're always talking about, archaeological ethics. It's a good idea to backfill your trench or your units. You can see how big this pit is, and it's still there today to collect rattlesnakes and tumbleweeds mostly. But luckily for us, it opens up a window to go back and reinvestigate, which you'll see we have done in the more recent past. In the 70s through the 80s, work continued on the South Bank. we're now to the era of color photographs for the most part here. But what you're looking at on the right is, again, a portion of the south bank that today is protected underneath the metal shelter that we call the interpretive center. So if you visit the site, keep in mind that a lot of those remains have been exposed since about 1983. All right, so it brings up an interesting struggle of how do you maintain an active archaeological site that's been exposed for going on almost 40 years now. In the 70s, ENMU was finally able to purchase the site in 1978, and work continued on the south bank. You can see one of those Scotts Bluff late Paleo-Indian artifacts there, associated with one of the bison kills that's preserved on the south bank. So I mentioned they returned to excavate that hand-dug well. And this was a project primarily conducted through the Smithsonian with Dennis Stanford and colleagues, Vance Haynes and George Agagino. And you can see an image of that questionable, is it a hand-dug well? Maybe in the bottom right there. And during this time, 1983 to 1984, and then again in the early 90s, is when much of the South Bank was opened up. And as I mentioned, a lot of that's been on display since that time. David Meltzer participated in the early 90s, and he actually had the opportunity to excavate the well. And then came the question of, well, if we're going to leave all this in place, how do we protect it? So in the early 90s, they devised, at the time, what was a pretty ingenious contraption. It's a 2x4 frame with PVC pipes and a giant tarp that in the morning, they'd roll it up to the top and they'd excavate. In the evening, they'd roll it back down. Wasn't the easiest to work in because you're already confined to your excavation unit. And now you have cinder blocks and PVC pipes and 2x4s that are just in the way. So in 1996, plans were developed to construct a permanent structure. And there's that metal building I've been mentioning, which we call the South Bank Interpretive Center. This is what it looks like inside if you ever get a chance to visit. There's multiple bison kills represented. The top layer is Cody complex for the most part, so late Paleo-Indian. The lower layer is Folsom Age. We are the quote-unquote Clovis site, and nothing on display here is of Clovis age. We're just not down deep enough yet. But importantly, just outside of the building, so if you go through that door there on the right, that's where that original 1932 gravel trench was that Edgar Howard worked in and eventually identified the Clovis type specimens. So bringing it to today, how do we use the site? It's a great resource to take classes out to, teach stratigraphy, talk about interpretation of prehistoric behavior, really from the context of a field archaeologist, because it's an opportunity to actually view the excavation and that process as it takes place and continues to take place. So we do go back most years and continue to excavate within this interpretive center, as well as other localities around Blackwater Draw. I mentioned that Ezekiel's pit was never backfilled, and in about 2000, I think it was 2013, David Kilby reopened and excavated Ezekiel's pit. And if you look on the left, you'll see a pretty stark contrast in the color of soils. The units that are down a little bit deeper are into that dark gray, organic rich soil. That is that top bone bed that you see in the interpretive center. So it's probably the same late Paleo-Indian Cody complex bison kill event that extends outside of the metal structure to the south. And the reason that these kills are specifically where they're at is because they're in the outlet channel of that prehistoric spring-fed lake. So 10,000 plus years ago, this was the low spot on the landscape. It's common behavior during that time to herd bison into these low spots where you get them kind of cornered, and then you can hunt them a little more successfully. We tested throughout that outlet channel, mostly just with coring for a half a mile to the south, and we hit bone the entire way. So that's not saying that it's the same kills necessarily, but it's suggesting to us that there's kill sites, bison kill sites specifically stacked up and down that drainage for at least a half a mile. The last field school we did was in 2019, and then shortly afterwards, we got shut down by COVID. And my plan is to go back this summer. So if anybody's looking for field work opportunities, here's my shameless plug. We're going to be excavating a locality where there's camel remains eroding out. It's hard to say at this stage how old they are, but they're right in the perfect spot for Clovis. We don't know if they're cultural. There's probably a 99% chance it's just a dead camel, but we'll never know until we go look. And if we can actually demonstrate that it's a camel that was hunted or butchered by humans, that just makes Blackwater Draw all that more significant. We do take our classes out and work in various places around the locality. It's a great hands-on opportunity that's in our own backyard here at the NMU. And some of the projects we're doing that are a little more lab focused right now are 3D scanning. You can see we started with just the Clovis projectile points, and we thought, well, we'll knock that out pretty quick. That was 3 years ago, and we're still working on the Clovis projectile points. So the goal ultimately is to 3D scan the entire collection. It just takes a little bit of time. Part of that struggle is there's a lot of material. This is just a sample of some of the Clovis points recovered throughout the years from Blackwater Draw. And I think what's important to point out here is that the two specimens recovered in 1936, they become the type specimens for Clovis. They don't really look anything like all these other Clovis points that we have from Blackwater Draw. So the type specimens themselves they're not reflective of Clovis technology very well, because we do have a lot of variation represented within that type. The one, I don't know if you can see the pointer on the screen or not, you might not be able to, but it's kind of in the middle and it's real shiny, short gray one made out of Edwards chert. It looks fake and it looks like it's plastic. And the reason for that is it was found in those spring deposits. So picture it being basically like in a rock tumbler that's producing that polish. So thinking about the site from an archaeological viewpoint, we can take students out and show them the changes in the soil colors from top to bottom, because everything's still in place and left there as it was discovered. And this is important for us because it helps produce a picture about environment change and climate change through time on the western edge of the Llano Estacado. And essentially what we see is that after that most recent Paleo-Indian bison kill, that spring-fed lake dries up. And we basically are in conditions similar to those that we see out here today. So a lot drier than it was 10,000 plus years ago. Minimum number of animals in these, the top layer has 22, the bottom layer has 9, and these numbers will continue to increase as we excavate more within the shelter here. So challenges, I mentioned some of this has been exposed since about 1983. Even though we're in a protected shelter, it doesn't keep all the critters out. We do get lizards and snakes and mice and pack rats, voles and other critters that get in. And the mice especially will claw up, as you can see in the bottom right, the edges of units where they have kind of their pathways throughout the archaeological site. And what's kind of interesting as well is they're still chewing on the bone, even though the bone is 10,000 plus years old. So that's suggesting that there is still some residual calcium within some of these bones that these rodents are targeting, not only for that, but also to file down their teeth. And we know they're there because we see them in person, but we also did an infrared scan within the interpretive center on a cold day. And you can see infrared me in the bottom left, but in the top right, you see those hot spots. Those are actually rodent dens that are behind the ground surface. So you can't actually see those, but because of the infrared, we actually know they're there. And what was fun is you could see them moving back and forth behind the wall of dirt. So infrared is one of those powerful scanning tools that we're really just beginning to experiment with in archaeology. We do have to maintain and clean the bone bed. And the center image, bottom, it's kind of hard to see, but you'll notice a couple centimeters of dust on the right, and then a cleaner surface on the left there. People ask, well, how do you clean a 10,000-year-old bison? And we use shop vacs. It's the easiest tool. It actually works a lot better than brushing does, as long as you don't suck up any bones or artifacts. So you have to be pretty careful with it. We host a series of events. Since we are a national landmark, we're open to the public. We do atlatl competitions, yucca fiber crafts, flint knapping, a couple times a year. And our annual atlatl competition, it's usually the last weekend of October, and it'll typically bring in about 200 people to participate. So that's usually our biggest event. Another struggle as director is how do you interpret today what is mostly just a giant hole in the ground? Sounds real exciting. But if you're ever out there, you'll see on the right, the red dashed line, we do have a walking trail. And if you do the entire loop, it's about a mile long. And along the trail, we have interpretive signage. There's 17 of these. And you also get to go into the interpretive center within the metal structure itself and view the ongoing excavation. So we are in the process right now of replacing all these signs. As you can imagine, the winds and the sun in eastern New Mexico, these things they don't last very long out there. So we're constantly updating and upgrading our interpretation. That brings us kind of to the end point here and some ideas of moving forward. Now everything's digital, it seems, and on your phone. So we have mapped the entire site with drones. That alone is pretty interesting because I mentioned Cannon Air Force Base. So the Air Force fly space, the boundary is the north fence of the site. And they fly gigantic drones out of there. We fly these little wimpy, dinky ones, but every time we're out flying them, we'll see one of the big drones from Canon come down and just watch us. So it's kind of intimidating. But map the entire site. So we do have aerial imagery that we're going to incorporate into virtual tours, which ultimately you can watch on your phone, so that if you don't get a chance to actually visit, you can still tour the site electronically over your phone device. So that's all I got for you, but I'm happy to answer any questions anybody may have.
Okay, Brendon, can you hear me? Do
I can hear you.
you have any questions in the room?
I got one.
Go ahead.
Lithic material was said to be from Central Texas, when one of the biggest sites is in the Panhandle. Is that, am I right? On the track there, is that what they said?
So Brendon, the question is, the majority of the lithic material at the site, despite it being located in the Panhandle, is coming from Central Texas. Is that correct?
And that's correct. And actually, we do see some differences in material types that are being used, specifically as you transition from Clovis to Folsom out here. But the majority of the Clovis spear points are made out of either Edwards chert coming from Central Texas, and I'd say that's probably 80% or more of them. And the other material we commonly see is alabates, which is closer. It's in the Panhandle, just north of Amarillo. What's interesting is that pattern changes when you get to Folsom, and the Folsom spear points are made almost exclusively from Edwards, from Central Texas, but their tools, a lot of those, their scrapers and knives, are being made out of alabates. So there's some difference there in stone selection and what they're using it for through time.
Is looting a major problem?
The question is looting at the site a major problem?
Funny you should ask that. I just got robbed today. But so yes, it does unfortunately still happen. It was more of an issue prior to 1978, prior to Eastern buying the property. And we know of at least 40 different private artifact collections that have artifacts from Blackwater Draw. And it does happen. We're working now to try to record and document as many of those collections as we can, just so we have a better picture about what was going on out here.
You ever find any obsidian artifacts out there?
The question is, do you ever find any obsidian artifacts? at the site?
We do. And there's actually a Clovis point made out of obsidian that has been sourced to western Utah, about 750 miles away from here. And that's the longest recorded or documented distance for material from the local source where it occurs to arriving at Blackwater Draw that we have. How it got here, whether it's people traveling that far prehistorically, which is entirely possible, or if it's trade, passing it down the line from group to group, that's possible as well. That's the only Clovis artifact we have, other than one other little tiny biface that Earl Green excavated in the 60s that is reported as from the Clovis layers. It's been sourced to Jemez, which is still in New Mexico, so it's not nearly as far away as the Utah source.
Any pottery?
Are you finding any pottery?
Very little. There's been some, and it's mostly just plain brownware. And by very little, I mean the total I think we have is 8 fragments from 90 years of work at the site.
Any questions from Zoom?
Yes, on Zoom, how much of the material would you estimate is heat treated?
How much of the material, yeah, you heard, great.
I got it. And that's a good question, and that's tough to say, especially with the Paleo-Indian stuff. The issue is much of it has that spring polish on it. So trying to determine that the glossy, glassy, or vitreous characteristic that you get from heat treating, how do you differentiate that from spring polish, which gives you basically the same physical appearance? There does appear to be a little bit, but not very much. And most of what I've seen, it's not necessarily the Edwards chert from Central Texas, which for the most part is high quality to begin with. It does increase its predictability and flakability if you heat it up and heat treat it. But most of the heat treating we're seeing is actually with alibates, which is a more dense material and a little tougher to flint knap if it's in its raw state.
That's it on
That's it on-
Zoom for now.
Any other questions in the room? No?
Do you think that there's more Blackwater Draw kind of archaeology further east along Blackwater Draw going into New Mexico?
So the question is, do you think there are additional potential Blackwater Draw like sites as you move east towards Texas, right? Not New Mexico?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. So if you follow Blackwater Draw straight down to the east and slightly south, you end up at the Lubbock Lake landmark, which is a comparable site. We do have a lot more Clovis represented at Blackwater Draw than anything that's been found at Lubbock. But as far as Lake Paleo-Indian, it's pretty similar. If you keep going down after you meet up the Yellow House Draw and it becomes the Brazos, you end up, if you go far enough, basically to the Galt site. And you end up on those Edwards Chert quarry outcrops. So the idea or notion of those drainages as routes of travel prehistorically, it's pretty compelling, and I'd say it's probably supported here at Blackwater Draw.
Question on Zoom, has there been any fire-cracked limestone found?
Short answer is no, because we don't have locally available outcrops of limestone here. What we see stratigraphically is we go from Clovis about 13,000 years ago, and then we drop back to about 5 to 7 million years ago, and we don't have anything in between. So we go from terminal Pleistocene to the top of the Ogallala Formation, the cap rock of the Ogallala Aquifer, which is all caliche in this region. So we don't have fire-cracked limestone. We do have burned caliche. Whether that's cultural or from lightning strikes and grass fires, it's hard to say.
Question on Zoom, are you finding other parts of the Atlatl weapons system, i.e. the bone foreshafts?
We only have from Clovis time period those bone rods, which we're still trying to figure out what those are, if they are a foreshaft or not. There's a lot of debate and discussion whether Clovis even used atlatls, or if that's a technology that comes in a little bit later in time, specifically with Folsom. And the reasoning behind that is when we look at the assemblage of Clovis projectile points to Folsom projectile points from Blackwater Draw, over 70, well, I shouldn't say 70, 67% of the Clovis projectile points are complete, whereas only a little over 20% of the Folsom artifacts projectile points are complete. So you can argue a couple different ways here. One is that Folsom's thinner, so it's more prone to breakage. But the other suggestion is this might actually reflect prehistoric hunting behavior. And the reason you have more complete Clovis points is they're not necessarily throwing them. They might be using them as thrusting spears. And if you're doing that, you're hitting the underbelly of the animal, you're hitting soft tissue, you're not hitting bone. If you're propelling the dart with an atlatl, you're hitting the broadside. So you're hitting solid mass, you're hitting bone, and the likelihood for point breakage is much greater. So that's been one suggestion, not only that I think is interesting or recognized here, but other people have seen it too. George Frizen and Jack Hoffman identified this pattern at other sites back in 1978. So it's an interesting idea.
We have one more question there.
Yeah, can you speak to the publications about Blackwater Draw? I noticed you didn't mention Jim Hester's publication and what we thought were major publications.
The question is, can you discuss what you feel are major publications from Blackwater Draw? Specifically a question about Hester's publication.
So that is the best summary of everything prior to 1972 is James Hester's 1972 Blackwater Draw Locality No. 1 volume. And that gives the best, like I said, kind of summary of everything I talked about today, but it's prior to, it mostly just goes up through the 1960s. And there is not a volume out yet, hint, hint, that updates the history research out here, that we're actually currently working on one that'll cover everything that's happened since 1972.
Well,
Is there a way to be in touch with them to know what's happening if you want to go there when they have events, that type of newsletter, something like that?
the question is there a way to be in touch with you, or like a newsletter or emails or a group or something to keep updated on goings on at the landmark and potential volunteer opportunities and field school stuff as well?
Absolutely. And I'll share my contact info with Alan, and I feel free to share that with all the members in the club. And I'd be happy to chat with any of you about future opportunities and what's going on out here. We used to have a newsletter, but it kind of fizzled out in about the early 2000s.
Okay, I think that's it for questions. Thank you for joining us from afar this evening, Brendon, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, and with that, February 9th meeting of the North Texas Archaeological Society will come to a close. Thank you all for coming this evening.